In the run-up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference, which turned out to be a complete failure, we had founded a nonprofit called the Jewish Climate Initiative out of our concern that the world really wasn't waking up, and we had to really mine the Jewish tradition for wisdom that could help us out of our crises that were really, in our view, largely of spiritual origin. And I still believe that it is a crisis of our complete detachment from the natural world, and we need to realign that. So after that initiative and Copenhagen's failure, a few years later, Nomi Tzur, who also went to Copenhagen to with Michael. You were in Copenhagen as well. You were at Windsor only for in the run-up. So then, as deputy mayor, started an organization or a program for Green Pilgrimage Jerusalem, and that's when I met Yonatan at that conference, and he shortly after that asked me to help him out in the organization that he had founded, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development. It was and it has been a great pleasure to work with him, and it is, I think, a tremendous initiative, and I'm really convinced of that after having now been in Paris at the climate summit for a little over a week and meeting other people of faith who I met sometimes just purely by chance. I was speaking with the Archbishop of the Greek Patriarch of Zimbabwe, and as I was speaking to him, after he'd given a beautiful presentation with this wonderful little twinkling smile, and up to him walked a couple of Africans from Ghana, and started talking to him. Somebody pulled the Archbishop away, so I started talking to these guys, and they're from an organization in Ghana called the Religious Network for Climate Change in Africa. And when I said I was from Jerusalem, as a real believing evangelical Christian, he was tremendously excited that he could possibly have Jews on board in their efforts in Africa. So I think this is very powerful work that we're doing. The COP21, the Conference of the Parties, ended in an agreement which most people were disappointed in. It was a tremendous compromise. So everyone was disappointed in something, but the very fact of 195 nations coming together and no one objected, and the process now is moving forward. And one of the key aspects that faith can bring, and that I think where Yonatan comes in so powerfully, is to offer hope. That even though this is a flawed agreement, it's a beginning now to carry us forward and to move the world towards sustainability. And the issue of sustainable development was really most strongly brought out by those small island nations that are developing, and certainly also the nations of Africa. And they were arguing very powerfully that they have a right to develop just as the North and the developed world has. And what that created was an obligation on the part of the developed world to now push tremendous amounts of resources, of financial resources, towards those areas. Again, whether that commitment will be kept is the responsibility of all of us to continue to push the governments to keep to their commitments. It's now, I think, appropriate to think about Paris, or let us hope that it really is truly a great turning and a true turning point. There was a sense in being there with all of those people. It's the first time I've been in a gathering of so many people who didn't have to try to convince anyone that this was an issue of critical importance. And so it was, there was a palpable feeling that we were participating in something momentous. Go ahead, Yudiga.
I've got a question about Paris, if I may. From what I understand from what I've been reading, the major points of agreement are not in any sense binding on the parties, but advisory. So the 2 points that all the nations will commit to reduce their emissions and to set targets, and also that the rich countries will transfer $100 billion to the poor countries. That's all. We'd like to do this, and yet the thing seems to be significant, and indeed, potentially a major turning point. But it's not an agreement and a treaty in any sort of traditional legal or binding sense.
It's a legally binding agreement, which has very, I would say, Spartan enforcement and verification portions to it. And all of the commitments that the governments, the 187 governments that have submitted plans, are indeed voluntary commitments. What's legally binding is the declaration of making the attempt to get keep the temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. If you add up all of the non-binding commitments that the nations have made, it will amount to about a 3.7 degree rise in temperature. So that the commitments fall way, way short of what we need. So it's a real paradox that the agreement itself carries within it. It's a strange hybrid. The United States didn't want it to be a treaty because then it would have to be taken for ratification by the U.S. Senate, and so therefore the U.S. demanded that it be not a traditional treaty. The rest of the nations of the world will, and each country has its own ratification process, but it's still, even if it's performed, it doesn't mean that we're going to be out of danger.
Do you think that there's something pretty positive about the fact that it depends on goodwill rather than on legal force?
Well, I felt such incredible goodwill and a spirit of cooperation in Paris that I have to say that is the most important thing, that the nations, all of the nations, got together and said, we're all in this together. And it requires international action. I heard recently that the Pope Francis encyclical is being discussed in Catholic communities almost as as Talmud might be in the Jewish world, of a daf yomi. They're taking a page at a time and studying the encyclical, which is sort of creating this groundswell of people of faith taking action. And whereas scientists weren't able to convince people to change their behavior, religion and people of faith have come along and said, let's trust that science is telling us the truth. Now we need to mobilize this from a moral perspective. We need to look at our patterns of consumption and the confusion that we have about our needs, our real needs, and our desires. And we need to put that back into our everyday consciousness. One of the things that was striking to me was when business was a major part at the Paris talks, and when it was a representative, I think, of the Bank of America, and business for years has opposed every environmental regulation, from air pollution and water, treatment and so forth, and business is now on board. Why? Because they said, we look for the best information available. And now science is telling us that if we don't do this, if we don't act sustainably, if we don't install solar energy or other alternatives, all business is not going to be sustainable.